For the past 150 years, we have released 500 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And of that, 27 billion tons in the last year alone. 1/3 of the carbon dioxide dissolves into the oceans, making them more acidic. All animals that have the ability to form a shell are already starting to dissolve. With increasing global temperatures, the glaciers in the Arctic are melting. The largest glaciers are receding at the rate of 1 kilometer per year. The Arctic ice cap has decreased by 40% in the last 30 years. Some parts of the Greenland glacier are receding at the rate of 30 to 40 meters per day. Sea levels will rise at least 3 meters by the end of the century, and because of floods, droughts, and the increase of hurricanes, 1 billion people will have to migrate in the next 100 years. "87% of the world's energy is made by burning fossil fuels that produce carbon dioxide. In 1990, we mined 4.6 billion tons of coal. In 2012, it reached 7.8 billion tons. That is an increase of 60% over a period of 22 years. Annual increase of coal production is 3%. In 2013, we mined 7,823 million tons of coal, which is 27 times the total weight of humanity, or as much as 25,000 Empire State Buildings. Meanwhile, we produced 4.4 billion tons of oil, or 3.3 trillion cubic meters of gas. About 13% of the world's energy production does not emit carbon dioxide, and of that, only 2% comprises wind, solar, and geothermal power. Solar farms must be located in remote barren areas and in close proximity to a gas line to compensate for when the sun isn't shining, such as at nighttime or when it's overcast. Similar arguments can be made about wind power, where energy production is limited to when the wind is blowing. 80% of the time, energy is produced by other means, usually with coal and gas. The production of electric power by harnessing the wind or the sun cannot keep up with the global increase in energy demand. What we are doing now is not working. Uranium and thorium are heavy metals that we mine from the earth and use for energy production. We do that by splitting the atom in a chain reaction. Each reaction is 1,000,000 times more powerful than the chemical energy we get from burning oil or gas. Most of the nuclear power plants we use today are so-called third-generation power plants. Their design, for the most part, is similar and traces back to the 60s. In their core, uranium is bound in ceramic rods. A chain reaction takes place inside them to produce heat. The heat transfers into water that heats up to about 300 degrees centigrade. To be able to reach that amount of heat, the core has to stay at over 70 times the atmospheric pressure. From the core, the water flows into a thermal converter that turns clear water into steam. The superheated steam flows into a turbine that produces electricity. The steam then saturates into water and goes back into circulation. From the beginning of nuclear power in the US, the amount of waste it has produced amounts to approximately 77,000 tons. That waste could all fit into a single football stadium, 3 meters high, and 90% of it can be recycled. 77,000 tons is nothing compared to the 7.8 billion tons of coal that we burn each year. For the coal ash contains radioactive materials in quantities that are greater by orders of magnitude, and all of them get released into the atmosphere. Thorium is an element that is 4 times more common than natural uranium, and it is 1,000 times more common than uranium-235, which is used in most of the nuclear plants today. Thorium is a byproduct in the mining of rare earth metals. The stockpile of thorium in the US alone is 2.6 million tons. That amount would power the planet for 500 years. In the core of a thorium plant, the fuel is mixed with liquid salt. Because the coolant is salt, not water, there is no need to keep the core under pressure, eliminating the risk of explosions. The salt in the core is at 600 degrees Celsius and flows into a heat exchanger to heat up clean salt. The clean salt flows into another heat exchanger and heats up gas. The gas flows into a gas turbine that produces electricity. The process spends most of the fuel, and the higher operating temperature ensures much greater efficiency. If the plant loses all power and loses the ability to ensure cooling, an ice plug under the core melts. The salt drains into a drain tank that absorbs the heat, and the chain reaction stops. The current design allows excess heat from the plant to be used to split hydrogen from water and combining it with carbon from the air, making fuels like methane, ammonia, and ether. By a similar process, you could purify seawater. 1 kilogram of thorium has the same energy density as 13,000 barrels of oil. Thorium power plants will release 1,000 times less waste than the classic uranium-powered plants, and most of that can be reused for other purposes. You can use plutonium-238 in a powerful battery, like the ones that power the Curiosity rover on Mars. There is also bismuth-213 and molybdenum-99, which are among the most valuable medical isotopes in the battle with cancer, and they exist in extremely limited supply. What if we don't have to think about saving energy? Endless amounts of clean, free energy for all the people of Earth. The battle for natural resources would be unnecessary. The grip that energy companies have on us would be meaningless. We could clean up this planet, turning deserts into forests or green fields. Food production wouldn't be limited, and farmers could have sunlight during the night, all year round, and could control the climate. The balance of need and production would shift from a society with endless need and limited resources into a society with limited need and endless resources. It's hard to imagine what it would mean for humanity to have access to limitless amounts of energy, because there is so much thorium in the ground and in storage that we will never run out.
Really, we are talking about molten salt reactors, and liquid fuel is really the key to that. It's the foundation for the advantages of molten salt reactors. Solid fuel, it's a complex challenge is the best way to put it. You make the slightest change to a solid fuel, change a spacer or a type of cladding, and you're looking at years of testing to make sure it functions properly. Radiation damage limits the burnup in solid fuel. And then decay heat removal. We can shut reactors down. Fukushima shut down, no problem. But it's the heat that's generated from all the radioactivity, we call that decay heat, that extends for days and weeks and months. Getting rid of that from solid fuel elements is the true challenge to making reactors safe, solid fuel reactors. Liquid fluoride fuel salts, though, the fuel is just unaffected by the radiation, very strong ionic bonds. That dramatically, of course, simplifies fuel qualification. The fuel is the coolant, and that just in many, many ways, there's a lot of tangents we could go on here, but it really simplifies decay heat removal because your heat source is mobile. And you're operating at low pressure with very, very high boiling points. So there was a lot of liquid fuel reactors looked at in the 50s and 60s, but really only these fluoride salts proved practical. Advantages, I'll only have one page here. We could probably do 10 or 20, but safety, it's that inherent safety, that passive decay removal, the fact that the liquids can naturally circulate so that they can be moved to other areas to deal with them, or within the reactor itself can naturally circulate to move the heat around. They're operating, like we said, at low pressure, and there's no chemical driving force within the reactor. There's nothing that could generate hydrogen like water, zirconium interactions. Just in a sense, nothing pushing its way out, which is a very good starting point. And very important in any solid fuel reactor accident are cesium and iodine. They're both volatile, so the many years of production are in that fuel pin just waiting to get out. With the molten salt reactors, cesium becomes a cesium fluoride, it's stable within the salt, and iodine becomes a form of iodide, and again, it's reasonably stable within fuel salt, and that gives us great safety advantage. Reduce capital cost and inherent safety can really simplify the entire facility. So all these things, including the low pressure operations, so thin-walled vessels, thin-walled piping, very high thermal efficiency compared to existing reactors, superior coolants in general. We need smaller pipes, smaller heat exchangers than current reactors, and very important, no complex refueling mechanisms. And that's, I'm Canadian, our CANDU reactors are great, but my God, the complexity of the refueling operations there. Long-lived waste issues, and they're an ideal system for consuming existing transuranic wastes. In spent fuel, it's really plutonium and the other ones, americium, neptunium, that's the problem. In spent fuel, 96% of it is relatively harmless, unused uranium. That's not really anyone's problem. There's 3% that are fission products, but that's a quite manageable problem because they're not as long-lived as the transuranics, which is only 1%. But many reactors, molten salt reactors included, can take that transuranics and turn them into useful energy. When we talk about the waste we do produce, even burner designs, and I'm going to go back and forth between this idea of burner and breeder, but even the burner designs can see almost no transuranics going to waste. And then resource sustainability and low fuel cycle cost. Thorium breeders, the MSR breeders, it's obvious, resource sustainability for millions of years, but even the burners they're extremely efficient on uranium, roughly 1/6 the needs of light water reactors if you choose the burner route. Quickly on the US historic timeline, first envisioned in the late 40s. In the 50s, they became a leading candidate for a quite well-funded aircraft reactor program. The Navy gave birth to the light water reactor. The Air Force, in a sense, gave birth to the molten salt reactor. Huge knowledge base developed, and a successful aircraft reactor experiment test reactor operated in 1954 at what still might be the highest temperature of a reactor, 860 degrees, just meant as a short-term test. That evolved in the 1960s and 70s into the MSBR molten salt breeder reactor. At the time, world thinking was there was very little uranium in the world. We found a lot through extensive efforts during the war, but back then people thought, well, we need breeders by the 1980s. So it's going to be either sodium fast breeders or the alternate technology was the molten salt breeder, the thorium breeder. So that really started to dominate research efforts in the United States. And the molten salt breeder reactor program had a very successful 8 megawatt thermal molten salt reactor experiment in the mid 1960s to late. Some minor issues uncovered, but very, very successful reactor. 70s though, falling of the political acts, the program was canceled in the mid 70s, and we won't get into all the different reasons, and there was a lot of different reasons. Some fascinating work continued at Oak Ridge, that's where the work was being developed for molten salt reactors. On a burner design called the DMSR, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. So that's a picture of the molten salt reactor experiment that many of you have seen many times. Just in a sense, a simple tank, graphite as the moderator, so you just have rods of graphite with spaces in between for the fuel salt to flow. In this case, a simple pot and a pipe leading out to a heat exchanger externally. This is from what we call the Gen 4 program, a world collaboration of what are the best advanced reactors to work on for the future. Molten salt reactors were chosen as one of 6 Gen 4 reactors. This is from their program guide. This is really the 1970s version, graphite moderated, on-site chemical processing, so you can be a breeder. You have to pull fission products out rather quickly to be able to be a breeder reactor. The freeze plug, which you've heard about before, dump tanks to deal with the decay heat. I think others will go into this as well, so I won't say too much. The only change in the Gen 4 being 2002, helium Brayton cycles were kind of all the rage. Most of my colleagues that we're talking about these are maybe back to steam now, or CO2 is interesting as well. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about, but that's what you'd probably call the textbook reactor. Summary of current world events, as I've chosen as one of 6 Gen 4 designs. Widespread grassroots support, which has definite pros, can have cons as well. The funded US efforts, a lot of my colleagues at Oak Ridge and elsewhere, they're looking at a cousin technology, which is traditional solid fuels, not like light water reactors, but graphite-based reactors, but replacing helium coolant with molten salt. So the same FLIBE salts as a replacement for helium. And there's a lot of advantages of that, but really when you really look at things, it lacks a lot of the major potential benefits that true molten salt reactors have. European efforts are focused on a fast spectrum version, getting rid of graphite. That's an admirable goal. It gives you many advantages, but a lot of challenges in that route, and even they are looking at quite a long development horizon. China, as you've already heard, really has led, I wouldn't say led the way, but really changed the playing field by their program, roughly a $500 million program, looking to build both a salt-cooled reactor first and quickly followed on by that of a true molten salt fueled reactor. Quite like the first demonstration of the MSRE. India, keeping options open. We had a very interesting conference there a couple of years ago. They had a lot of efforts going in the 1970s that many of us weren't aware of. And as you've heard and will hear, several startup firms worldwide. So why the renewed interest? Light water reactors have served the world well, but there's really only incremental improvements possible. Going to small modular reactors with light water, that's definitely some benefits there. But nothing that's going to be a true game changer. And it's the passive safety of molten salt reactors that really opens the possibility of true cost innovation. And that's really needed if we are going to build these by the hundreds and thousands. Molten salt reactors open up the possibility of reducing the nuclear waste profile and the ability to consume existing waste. They can be configured as factory fabricated small modular reactors. And when you're talking about, well, modern molten salt reactors, it's quite logical to first look to the past. Now I'm going to get quite technical here, and those that you can understand probably have heard me talk about this already, so I'll zip through this so you can ask me questions later, but a lot of challenges for that textbook design from the 1970s. On-line fission product removal, do not estimate the difficulty of that. Much simpler than processing solid fuels, but still a great challenge. Tritium control, molten salt reactors using enriched lithium and beryllium as their carrier salt will produce a fair amount of tritium, and stopping tritium has this annoying habit of going right through hot metal walls. So tritium control was always a big part of early work. Reactivity coefficients, again, how you always want the reactor to power down if the temperature gets hotter. They were the needed negative term, but only calculated to be quite weakly negative. The use of highly enriched uranium, which I don't really want to get into too much, but that word alone and a thorium breeder by definition involves that. As soon as you say those three words, you're going to get a lot of doors closed in your face. Off-gas handling, we talked a little bit about xenon and krypton coming out, and those can have daughter products that we have to keep an eye on. So that is a challenge. Noble metal fission products tend to plate out on surfaces. That can give you a challenge, nothing insurmountable, of course. And then long-term corrosion and radiation damage. Oak Ridge developed very good materials for these, a lot of testing, but proving that for 50, 60 years of current reactors is a challenge. And then if you're using graphite, if you want to talk about replacing graphite, that is maybe harder than you think. So why graphite? If you're looking at, well, what should a modern one, why should we use graphite? Because it does indeed present challenges. There's disposal issues. That varies greatly when we're finished with the graphite as a moderator. It will be modestly radioactive. Chlorine-36 is something that can be involved, so it varies greatly by regions, depending on regulations for that. It's largely a perception issue. There's not much radiation involved here, but still of importance. It does add, theoretically, a chemical potential, but in fact, it's almost no added safety concerns. There's something called Wigner energy, which some of you might have heard of. That was the cause to start the wind scale fire in the UK, but that's not an issue at higher temperature reactors like molten salt reactors. Graphite is near impossible to burn. The wind scale fire was not graphite burning, it was the metallic uranium and metallic aluminum cladding that was really burning. And Chernobyl was, well, it was a mess of a design to begin with, but that was basically a nice furnace that had everything was blown apart, air blowing through, and 2,000 degree plus molten corium, the molten form of the solid fuel, driving reactions there. Why graphite? It does give you many large advantages. It's the only unclad moderator that's possible to use with the molten salts. Graphite enables, you can protect all your structural materials, all the metallic structures, etc., from high neutron fluence by a method we call the under-moderated outer zones. You can't do that with the fast spectrum reactors. More thermal spectrum aids the reactor control things. It just slows things down in general, long neutron lifetimes. Makes your power truly scalable from large to very small. Massive reduction in the needed fissile material to start the reactors. And if we're using low enriched uranium as your fuel salt, it's a surprisingly low, theoretically down to about 1%, probably 2 to 4% is a more practical region. So why a thorium breeder? Thorium breeder, it is a very admirable goal, and groups like this should continue the effort. It's a very simple message to the public. It will give us potentially millions of years of resource. But the breeder approach does represent many unique challenges, especially online fuel reprocessing. And that, unfortunately, will lengthen development time. And long development times mean private funding is extremely hard. Governments will not lead any more in nuclear development, but they will follow. They will follow private capital. So we know now that uranium is quite abundant. Yes, if you look at the Red Book, it says there's only 80 years at current use, but if you look how much, there's probably 30 years of copper. If we need more, the price might rise a little bit, but then there's more lower grade ores. So there's a lot of uranium out there. So do we need to go straight to a breeder? Because an MSR burner, which you know I'm going to be pitching here, that can simply use low enriched uranium as the fuel, as the makeup fuel and the startup fuel, and use it much, much more efficiently than current light water reactors. The MSR burner approach immediately removes many of the big challenges from the breeder approach to greatly simplify things and shorten your development period. The last major work of Oak Ridge was on a burner design, the denatured molten salt reactor, which I'll talk very briefly about here. They called it the 30-year once-through design. So you're using the same salt, you start up with low enriched uranium, trickle in a little bit more low enriched uranium every year, originally mandated to increase anti-proliferation features. So you're starting with the legal limit of low enriched uranium, 20%, only to be able to put in as much thorium as possible. I view in this case thorium, it's like a fuel additive. It makes your fuel economy better. I'll get back to the pros and cons of thorium or not. There's no salt processing, just add small amounts of low enriched uranium. A low power density core gave a full 30-year lifetime out of the reactor, but that made it quite big, 8 by 8 meter core and about a 10 by 10 meter reactor vessel. Similar fizzle starting to a light water reactor. Uranium needs, depending on whether you look to recycle the uranium at the end of the 30 years, was either 1/6 or 1/4 of the uranium needs, only about 1/10 of a cent a kilowatt hour for fuel cost. And that's modern day numbers. About 1/9 of the transuranic waste and that's assuming you didn't do anything with the plutonium except put the salt to geological storage. Much better reactivity coefficients than the breeder. The breeder was calculated to be just slightly negative. A French reworking of things were worried it might actually be slightly positive, but the burner approach was a nice strong negative. And it's really cool reactor physics of why that is the case if you want to pester me later. I want to kind of debunk some burner myths because these aren't thorium breeders and some will raise problems. And I hear this, if it's not a breeder, it's not sustainable. Well, but when you really look, the burners are extremely efficient on low enriched uranium. So you theoretically could replace every light water reactor, coal and gas plant with burners and see little, if any, need to increase current uranium mining. And current uranium mining is a drop in the bucket compared to other mining. We won't have millions of years worth like thorium, but easily thousands, is even if you allowed the price of uranium to rise tenfold, it's just an enormous potential reservoir of uranium. The other myth, I would say is a myth, is the MSR burner means you're making plutonium waste, therefore it solves nothing. The burners produce a lot less PU waste because, I won't get into the physics, but we burn up so much of it right in the reactor if we're running them this way. And we have the ability, After a long period of time, we can do this a decade later, we can recycle the plutonium and all the rest, americium, neptunium, and just put it in other fuel sources. So we have the same ability as MSR breeders or the sodium fast breeders to close the fuel cycle. So you're really only having fission products and maybe some relatively harmless unused uranium as your waste. But that's a nation's choice. If a nation wants to go right to the once through cycle, there's a lot of real solutions now. Salt caverns are an excellent place to put spent fuel if we ever choose to do that way. Another one is MS burners require uranium enrichment. And I will concede that point, that yes, but if we're running the world using burner type reactors, because we do it so much more efficiently already, we need so much less enrichment, we don't really need to increase the current enrichment facilities. And you're not going to really uninvent a technology. I won't really, anyway, just a quick mention. There's an interesting synergy with CANDU reactors that use natural uranium. They're actually quite good producers of plutonium, and we could use that as a fuel source for burner reactors. So you could have a fleet expansion without enrichment. Issues solved just by going to the burner approach. Fission product removal, we don't have any need for on-site processing. We may choose to process the salt once we're finished it, but like I say, that's a nation's choice. Tritium control, we're not giving up on enriched lithium or beryllium, but when you're not a breeder, not trying to save every last neutron, we have the ability to use non-flied carrier salts that really knock down the tritium production by about 99%. Reactivity coefficients, the burner designs it's really between uranium-233 and plutonium and uranium-235, just far superior reactivity coefficients. Off-gas management, we don't have to pull the gases out really, really quickly like you want to do with a breeder design, but it just gives us more options, which again, I won't go into too many details. Highly enriched uranium use, we're not using that. The uranium is always denatured. Any PU present really quickly builds up to a lot of 240 and a lot of 242. Both those make it virtually, if not literally, impossible to use in weapons.